So, racial capitalism as a concept, phrase, and framework for intellectual inquiry has been growing in popularity since Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. In it, Robinson argues that he uses racial capitalism to identify, quote, the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society, which pursued essentially racial directions, unquote. This meant that racism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. Though this notion has been more accepted and is an operationalized method for applying racial capitalism to different inquiries on race and the capitalistic process, racial capitalism, I argue, finds its genesis in the much earlier 20th century scholarship of Black African theoreticians and political scientists, though the phrase racial capitalism itself may have not been used. So this video will explore the works of W.E.B. Du Bois, Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, Frantz Fanon, and Claudia Jones to illustrate the diverse body of work coming from all aspects of the diaspora, Africa, the United States, and the Caribbean. They were both Marxist-inspired and Marxist-critiquing works that theorized about how conceptualizations of race and racism worked in tandem with capitalism and impacted the everyday lives of non-white peoples of the world. This study finds that social differentiation, an important aspect of racial capitalism, Robinson and most other scholars agree on, and its various expressions can be found among the writings of the scholars I just mentioned. These expressions are the racialization of labor markets in the U.S. context, that's Du Bois, the triple oppression of capitalism, expounding on the necessarily gendered aspect of capitalism's social differentiation, and that's Claudia Jones, cultural imperialism and how it propels capitalist exploitation, that's Cabral, and neocolonialism as a social formation that is the last stage of imperialist expansion, and this part both Fanon and Nkrumah talk about. And so it should be noted that an intellectual history of any group of people may be an arbitrary task that might inadvertently fall into the same kind of elitist trap that it seeks to critique by highlighting the history of the general as opposed to the soldier, so to speak. With this in mind, this inquiry rather hopes to highlight influential individuals whose raison d'etre is instantiated by the collective consciousness that necessarily comes with decolonial and national liberation movements. So that's my little justification piece there. So, like neoliberalism and capitalism, racial capitalism has been a sort of ubiquitous phrase in and out of academia, especially in the wake of moments of intense racial tensions. One such moment was the, of course, tragic 2020 murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police. And after this and many other tragedies like it, leftist critics and organizations were once again employing racial capitalism in tweets and articles to sort of articulate the essentially racialized means through which capital, labor, and violence function in Black communities across the United States. And credit largely goes to Cedric Robinson for conceptualizing racial capitalism as the idea in which the process of a capitalist mode of production is instantiated by race and racialization. So in Black Marxism, Robinson maps the racial origins of Western civilization as we know it now to underscore and reveal how capitalism's emergence could not escape the already present method of classifying groups in racial logics. So in the foreword to Black Marxism, Robin D.G. Kelley writes, "Capitalism was racial not because of some conspiracy to divide workers or to justify slavery and dispossession, but because racialism had already permeated by Western feudal society." So here, Kelley cites Robinson's findings that intra-European or within European relations already assumed racial logics, even if current conceptualizations, how we now understand race and racism, do not fit neatly into its previous conceptualization. So, for example, in citing Robinson, Kelley notes that the first European proletariats were racial subjects, Irish, Jews, Roma, Slavs, etc., and they were victims of dispossession, enclosure, colonialism, and slavery within Europe. It is not a logical stretch, then, that once Europeans reached a stage of development that allowed for overseas colonial and imperialist domination, to conclude that, quote, the peoples of the Third World began to fill this expanding category of a civilization reproduced by capitalism, unquote. So what Robinson provides then is a sort of origin story of racialization, capitalism's unavoidable encounter with it, and how capitalism's genesis and spread was governed by a racial logic that necessitated the proletarization of those people that are deemed lesser for material benefits. So scholars since Robinson's argument have been, like I said, operationalizing, making use of racial capitalism for various inquiries regarding the capitalist process of accumulation and race as part of that governing logic. However, in this study, I want to work backwards from Robinson's synthesis of racial capitalism in order to begin to build a rough genealogy of his predecessors. And so, since any list is, of course, necessarily finite, this work makes no claim to be all-encompassing, but it is one inquiry that hopes to sketch a history of the ubiquity of racial capitalism, a powerful phrase that continues to shape the radical intellectual history dimension of Black African studies and many other social science fields as well. Okay, so locating racial capitalism, a literature review once more. And taking a clear understanding of racial capitalism, Julian Go's 2021 study identifies two general tendencies among various uses and definitions by scholars in various fields. So Julian Go finds that 1, racial capitalism denotes some general connection between race and capitalism. And that 2, quote, it is typically used to refer to global relations rather than capitalism within a single national context, unquote. With these two tendencies identified, Go goes on to identify 3 key unresolved tensions within racial capitalism. 1 is the ambiguity of race. 2 is the potential misunderstanding of Marx by proponents of racial capitalism. And 3, whether racial difference is a logical or contingent necessity for capitalism. And how we can understand logical and contingent necessity is that logical necessity means that something is imminent to the theory. Things are the way they are because there is no logical alternative. And contingent necessity is that it refers to something that follows from specific historical conditions or social circumstances. That's the definition that Julian Go provides. So Go does not seek to reveal the parochial nature of racial capitalism or to critique it to obliteration, but rather point out how the concept could grow analytical and maybe even theoretical cohesion based on a head-on exploration of these tensions that could only be resolved through further study. So for the first and third tensions, as in the ambiguity of race and whether racial difference is a logical or contingent necessity, Go posits that social differentiation as a phrase may be a better descriptor since it automatically includes various methods of differentiation. For the second, Go argues that there needs to be a difference between Marx's theory of capital and Marx's theory of capitalism, where in the former, Marx did not center race or rationalization, but he did so in the latter. So Go's inquiry raises important questions, and though more studies have utilized racial capitalism in the more general sense, how racial hierarchies can be functional for capitalist social orders, there have not been works to augment the concept itself. So though this study does not seek to augment the theory or concept per se, it sort of hopes that by exploring its conceptual origins, useful insights are further distilled. And so, since I'm working backward from Robinson's 2000s thesis, it would be useful to understand the appropriateness of race as the modifier for capitalism and the global appeal that its proponents champion. For some places, the proletarization process may take place on the grounds of religion, but the operative power of racial capitalism, rather than race specifically, is that it denotes differentiation generally. This is because nationality, ethnicity, and even religion are things that are increasingly racialized categories, which makes race the best sort of modifier for capitalism, at least until something better could be developed. But I argue that racial capitalism is capacious enough to hold all these things. Granted, at first glance, race itself may seem to limit racial capitalism's meaning strictly in terms of the color of one's skin, but because of the discursive nature of race and its interaction with other categories, a more flexible imagination of race is needed when thinking about racial capitalism. So, in addressing the gaps in the decolonial debate of contemporary South Africa, a 2022 study by Mabasa examines the contributions of neo-Marxist thinkers like Bernard Magubane, Amilcar Cabral, Oliver Cox, and Eric Williams to explore how, among other questions, racial capitalism understands colonial and neo-colonial political economy. The portion of the study most relevant to us here is the way that racial capitalism is defined and operationalized. Mabasa is able to use racial capitalism as a framework to do an intellectual history and as a scaffolding to address the political economy dimensions that are imperative or important to the discussions of colonialism and neocolonialism. So, Here, Mabasa points that without an examination of the world capitalist system, which the covered scholars stressed, we cannot fully comprehend modern colonialism and neocolonialism. So Mabasa writes, the main aim in racial capitalism discourse is to highlight the intersecting relationship between capitalism and social differentiation in different historical epochs. So racial capitalism theory is not concerned with which came first or which form of differentiation constitutes the worst type of oppression, which is sort of like oppression Olympics. Rather, it is about how various types of social differentiation in capitalism work symbiotically or work together for the effective work of extractive and exploitative capitalist accumulation. So Mabasa argues that the discourse of racial capitalism is concerned with how it manifests and remanifests differently through time and how scholars begin to apprehend this shape-shifting phenomenon to better anticipate it and presumably combat it. In this query, Mabasa's most relevant contribution is the distillation of key aspects of racial capitalism in the context of decolonization and decolonial politics, the material basis of modern imperial capitalism, and the connections between social differentiation and capitalism's development, as well as the international or supranational nature of capitalism. And so what Robinson's racial capitalism has done then is to provide the conceptual framework to understand the internal and complex logics of colonial and neocolonialism to better develop a political and intellectual framework to combat it. So critiques and concerns of racial capitalism largely stem from its, again, unclarity, partly stemming from the multiple ways it has been used, but also because of how it treats, quote, Black subjectivity as a debilitated condition deriving from an African American exceptionalism. That's one scholar's take. It has also been critiqued for lacking the hard work of epistemological elucidation, logical clarification, and historical elaboration. In a sense, its cohesiveness, there lacks a cohesion. In a similar and rather disrespectful vein, it has also been noted that racial capitalism's conception of race does not fit for other geographical areas like conceptions of race in the Indian Ocean, for example. And I say disrespectful because the scholar who has this critique uses the word, this is what he says about Cedric Robinson. He says that racial capitalism has not been rigorously examined because of, quote, the impulsion of the writings of Cedric Robinson and his followers. So there's this notion that, Cedric Robinson's magnum opus, Black Marxism, was a sort of impulse writing, and that his followers are sort of just taking his words for facts, which I just didn't really like the wording of impulsion. So that's why I said disrespectful vein. But that is one critique that exists. And so, like I said, this study does not seek to provide a grand theory of racial capitalism, but rather by using part of Robinson's conceptualization of racial capitalism, the symbiosis of race and capitalism, the study hopes to build a Black intellectual history of contributors whose work will be helpful in racial capitalism's consolidation as a cohesive theoretical framework in future studies. I am not a theorist, clearly, so that's why I keep emphasizing that, again, I'm not seeking to say, well, these are parts of racial capitalism, and so this is what racial capitalism is. That's not really my goal here. My goal is to say what influenced the concept of racial capitalism and where can we find some of those influences within the scholars that I wanted to talk about. So starting off with Du Bois and the racialization of labor markets. So Du Bois off-cited 1889 and 1935 texts, the Philadelphia Negro and Black Reconstruction respectively, are the works in which Du Bois first explored the relationship Black folk in the U.S. have with the capitalistic process. Though these works were written and published in the years before Du Bois's Marxist-esque radical turn, they nonetheless informed the leftist politics he begins to espouse by the latter half of the 20th century. In these works, Du Bois lays out what is probably the first image that forms in one's mind when one thinks of racial capitalism, the racialization of labor markets, the way in which the relegation of Black workers to what we now call blue-collar and industrial work created the racial divide or the color line in the workplace. Post-emancipation of Black Americans were largely, and to a certain extent still are, concentrated in various service industries, be they in the North or the South. So in this sense, as well as from the vantage point of posterity, racial capitalism sort of stares one in the face, right? Du Bois's the Philadelphia Negro, more informed by liberal politics, studied the class differentiation among Black Philadelphians, as in the existence of a Black bourgeoisie, and how the lack of this recognition among whites was a point of frustration for the black bourgeoisie. Like, hey, we exist too. There are rich black folk. You shouldn't only judge black folks based on the lower class black folk, which obviously came from the sort of, anxiety of not wanting to be grouped with other black people. So his 1903 talented 10th doctrine that the, quote, Negro race, like all other races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men was only a natural conclusion to how the working class, not because of inherent deficiencies, but because of systemic issues, would need the help of those exceptional enough to slip the worst of the systemic issues. Here, Du Bois locates the black bourgeoisie, charges them with the uplifting of their race, while later maintaining that black folk have not yet been as stratified in the class sense equal to that of the white population. In other words, there is no significant or even a proportional population of upper-class blacks in the U.S. In his August 1921 column in Crisis magazine, he writes, "The colored group is not yet divided into capitalists and laborers. There are only the beginnings of such a division. Today, to a very large extent, our laborers are capitalists and our capitalists are our laborers." So in the early 20s, just decades after emancipation, the black population was largely still a proletariat population, and even, quote, the professional class were sons and daughters of porters, washerwomen, and laborers. The racial and racial capitalism that Du Bois finds but doesn't call racial capitalism is a racialized labor market in which race actively determines one's job and hence one's class. So in his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction, Du Bois builds on his localized study of the blacks in Philadelphia by looking at the history of black labor during Reconstruction. Before Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, Du Bois was able to recognize the dialectic relationship between the U.S. North and South and how the slave-powered agricultural South enabled the heavy industrialization of the North and the Western world, partly because of Europe's dependence on American exports. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Du Bois continuously finds that the capitalist process in the U.S. and in parts of the Western world were and continue to be racialized, whether it be through the logic of American slavery or through the labor market post-emancipation. Though Du Bois understood the inherently racial nature of the capitalism of his time and identified its now canon element, it was not until 1948 that Du Bois rescinds his earlier talented 10th prescription to the ills caused by capitalism. He recognizes this 10th could easily climb the highest pedestals capitalism has to offer for the sole purpose of self-betterment. So he writes, "My plan of training a talented 10th might put in control and power a group of selfish, self-indulgent, well-to-do men whose basic interest in solving the Negro problem was personal freedom, and unhampered enjoyment and use of the world, without any real care, or certainly no arousing care, as to what became of the mass of American Negroes or of the mass of any people." This marks Du Bois's shift to the understanding of how the racialist capitalist process can alienate the black bourgeoisie from the masses. Though Du Bois's publishing lifespan certainly does not conclude here for the purposes of this study, we depart from Du Bois's foundational analyses and pick up with Claudia Jones and her super-exploitation or triple oppression thesis. This in many ways becomes a continuation of how a racialized group is further differentiated through the capitalistic process, more specifically through the intersections of race, gender, and class. So, Jones and the triple oppression. So, contemporary to Du Bois, Claudia Jones in the 1940s was an avowed Marxist-Leninist and an engaged member of the Communist Party USA. Though Jones came to the U.S. from Trinidad, her politics had a transnational and diasporic orientation. This was most evident in her political writings, where she raised the question of black women workers' position in the capitalistic process. In her most significant work, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, Jones writes, "Negro women, as workers, as Negroes, and as women, are the most oppressed stratum of the whole population." Jones argued that the capitalist process needed the triply exploited labor force of black women. Capitalism impacted black women workers in a different way than both black men and white women, what she calls the special oppression. To explain this, Jones notes that black women in the U.S. consisted of a population that were overwhelmingly limited to service work, and so were a significant population of the proletariat, and were also a larger proportion of breadwinners as compared to black men. In the seminal biographic work of Jones, Davis notes, Jones' superexploitation thesis rests on the fact that black women, by virtue of being located as they are in society among the most exploited and most underpaid of workers, tend to be the ones whose value of their labor power various other class fractions, including other exploited workers, benefit from. Black women, as the poorly paid, bottom of the barrel workers who did backbreaking menial service sector jobs, became the means through which surplus value was extracted for the propelling of the capitalism profit driven goal. Jones does not limit her thesis to the condition of the black woman worker in the mid-century, but also argues that this proletarization of black women was a historical process that finds its roots in the era directly after emancipation as well. She notes how the likes of the Negro Church and the general patriarchal structure of black households were the site in which the subordination of Negro women developed. Black women in the post-emancipation era in the mid-20th century then were the population that experienced the most brute form of capitalist exploitation as black, as women, and as most entirely working class. The capitalist system, according to Jones's triple oppression analysis, was another complex expression of social differentiation. Racial capitalism, as envisioned by Jones, then necessarily involves the question of how race and gender become another means to further practice social differentiation. This iteration of social differentiation showed the way in which gender determined the kind of labor one could do, and when race got involved, how much one could get paid, or vice versa. By centering black workers, Jones and Du Bois were able to point to the ways in which the racialized and gendered nature of labor became indispensable to the raison d'etre of the capitalist process, the realizing of ever-increasing surplus values. The discourse on social differentiation and capitalism continues in the era of decolonization. Here we shift to the African continent and take up with Cabal, who I've talked about before, who explores how culture and cultural imperialism becomes one of the most visible forms of social differentiation in the era of revolutionary Africa. So Cabal on culture, right? So one of the most known and widely cited work of his is his 1966 speech titled The Weapon of Theory, formerly published in 1979 by the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, PAIGC, as Unity and Struggle. This is a collection of speeches and essays in the years Cabal was an active member and leader of the PAIGC. In his speech, given to the First Solidarity Conference of the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Cabal elucidates his theory of history, what he sees as the different manifestations of imperialism, and the role that culture plays as an effective means to combat imperial domination to realize national liberation. So, Cabal argues that those who assert that the motive force of history is a class struggle are partly correct, but to make it more universal, one needs to consider the essential characteristics of some of the colonized peoples dominated by imperialism. Inspired by Hegel in their Communist Manifesto, for example, Marx and Engels had long declared that the history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. Cabal seeks to amend that by noting that it is rather the mode of production that would be more appropriate if one seeks to truly universalize this claim. This is partly because class, the way Marx and Engels imagined it, is very much so historically contingent. They were coming from and largely speaking to workers as they understood them to be in Europe. It raises questions about what to make of a civilization that did not have or grow to develop classes in the way that would produce the antagonism necessary for the creation of history. Following Marx's theory to its logical conclusion would hold that those who do not develop classes did not have history. Quote, it would be to consider that various human groups in Africa, Asia, and Latin America were living without history or outside history at the moment when they were subjected to the yoke of imperialism. This is why Cabral instead posits that the factor that pushes history forward is rather the mode of production, the level of productive forces, and the system of ownership characteristic of that group, which is in turn the essential determinant of the content and form of class struggle. Cabral reaches this conclusion because he surmises that the definitions of class and class struggle themselves rely first on the mode of production, making it the sort of remainder or base from which historical processes are enacted. This is necessarily a materialist analysis of the world to which Cabral argues is most applicable across various groups, especially those who have been relegated to the dustbin of history. For Cabral, the mode of production manifests in three main stages: man's mastery of nature, private appropriation of the means of production, and lastly, the elimination of private appropriation and the removal of class struggle. paving the way for new and unknown forces that then push history forward. All these stages are, however, still determined by culture, Cabal argues. So he says, culture is simultaneously the fruit of a people's history and a determinant of history by the positive or negative influence it exerts on the evolution of relations between man and his environment and among men or human groups within a society, as well as between different societies. If culture did not play a central role in the colonial and imperial domination, then how does one explain apartheid? Or why European powers even bothered with the propagating of myths of assimilation, especially the French and Portuguese? Although Cabral's analysis might be deemed culturally determinist, one can call out how culture's central role in economics and economic exploitation and domination, in turn an act that necessarily comes with taking up arms against the destroying and neutralizing or paralyzing of cultural life, is an expression of the social differentiation that Robinson and most scholars agree is central to racial capitalism. If there is a dependent and reciprocal connection existing between the cultural factor and the economic and political factor in the behavior of human societies, foreign domination and imperialism and active capitalist accumulation scaled up to the international level need cultural disruption to succeed. The racial capitalism for Cabral finds its expression in cultural imperialism. By scaling the culturally determined social differentiation up to international levels, Nkrumah then provides an analysis of neocolonialism that shows how the national bourgeoisie, both as a class and a state leader, is alienated from the African masses it purports to lead in the wake of what Nkrumah calls flag independence. So I've definitely talked about Nkrumah and Fanon before, I think, specifically in my Ethiopia video, but I think a good rundown of their ideas would be helpful and is also included in my research. So, although independence should easily be the apotheosis of statehood, for African countries, independence was again more of a ceremonial process that marked the cosmetic shift in the order of things. Leaders were still handpicked by European powers. Wealth for those with high estimations of settler colonialism was still concentrated among Europeans, and economic deals were still unbalanced and favorable to the metropoles. And despite the formal acknowledgement of independence, the real work of nation building and organization were still a monumental task that Africans were faced with. This was the state of Africa in the 60s, and noticing this, Nkrumah offers an analysis of neocolonialism. He argues that neocolonialism was the beginning of the end for colonial capitalism. He says colonialism has achieved a new guise and has become neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Its final bid for its existence as monopoly capitalism or imperialism is the last stage of capitalism. It is in the wake of this crisis that colonizing countries allowed independence while making sure their influence was intact through the leaders that Fanon characterizes as the national bourgeoisie. Although Fanon precedes Nkrumah and he does not use the word neocolonialism, he supports this idea of the detrimental role of the national bourgeoisie in realizing independence. He writes that instead of being the coordinated crystallization of the people's innermost aspirations, instead of being the most tangible, immediate product of popular mobilization, national consciousness is nothing but a crude, empty, fragile shell. So Fanon is writing about the national bourgeoisie. He's very much pessimistic and cynical about their role in actually leading the countries, these newly independent countries, in a way that will actually benefit the masses, in a way that will actually build a true anti-colonial national ethic. They obviously fail, since a lot of them do collude, and the ones that don't are targeted and assassinated by various agencies around the world. Nkrumah and Fanon's formulations of the neocolonial rule of the national bourgeoisie is an expression of social differentiation that is necessary for the racial capitalistic process. The macro of Nkrumah's neocolonial thesis, whereby formerly colonized countries maintain the extractive economic relationship with their former colonizers, is maintained through the national bourgeois leaders whose class aspirations and hence political leanings are antagonistic to the workers or peasantry of Africa. Though ethnic nationalism later becomes a more acute problem in African countries and obscures the class-based antagonism, Nkrumah and Fanon early on identified the intra-ethnic class division that required demands of the neocolonial relationship. The cross-cutting social differentiation maintained the extractive relationship that typified the way capitalism operated in Africa. It did not lead to mass industrialization, but the entrenchment of the colonial capitalist process. Colonizing European countries no longer needed their own colonial governors to make sure natural resources and cash crops were transported out of Africa on Europe's terms. They identified other Africans who would do just that. And so, though racial capitalism has become more of a phenomenon in the 21st century, the connection between racialization and social differentiation and capitalism have been deeply explored and recognized by Black activists and intellectuals in the 20th century. This intellectual history of select theoreticians is only a dip in the ocean of Black radical thought that has long been concerned over the inherency of race to capitalism, the redundancy of racial and racial capitalism. Though this study looked at different iterations of social differentiation, of which race as we understand it today is one part, it holds that because of the discursive nature of race, racial capitalism can be a useful way to conceptualize how capitalism requires social differentiation. As stated before, various categorizations of identity are racialized, be it religion, nationality, ethnicity, and even gender, until a better phrase that sort of encapsulates both social differentiation and capitalism is developed. Racial capitalism, for at least right now, might be one's best bet. If the racial in racial capitalism is too contemporarily contingent or just too political, then one might simply default to social differentiation. However, this choice risks losing the simultaneous specificity and genericness racial evokes, the specificity and genericness that allows scholars the leeway to decide the extent to which they will weave into their case study and argument. So, just some closing thoughts. I think racial capitalism has yet a long way before it becomes a consolidated theoretical framework that is applied in the same way across various disciplines. Its biggest critics largely criticize it for this lack of cohesion. However, this does not mean scholars should refrain from evoking it, especially if it encapsulates the real-life discursive and complex ways race and capitalism feed off each other. That racial capitalism is capacious enough to be used in the study of race and hiring practices, banking on colonialism in the 19th century, bonds in municipalities, student debt, and more, can be a point of strength, a strength that shows how race and capital rear their ugly head when one looks closely enough. When Robinson first conceptualized racial capitalism and Black Marxism, he provided an origin story of race and capitalism and how capitalism had always used racial logics in its development and spread. What scholars have done since then is show how these racial logics can be exhumed within specific case studies, whether it be in finance, labor, or macro or microeconomics. And what this study has done is to reveal the multimodal origins and uses of racial capitalism in the hopes that both scholars and activists can employ and develop it to understand exactly how capitalism oppresses and ultimately to develop more effective ways to combat it. As always, thanks for watching. I did get an A on this paper. I think my professor enjoyed it. I'm sure you will have thoughts. Lay it on me. I know it's not perfect. But I always do enjoy looking at the theories and works of the, greatest thinkers in Black and African history. I really am into intellectual history, and little studies like this helps me get to explore their work in a structured way where I am looking for answers and I'm not just sort of diving head deep into their entire publishing history. Like, imagine reading Du Bois from when he was in his 20s to when he was in his 60s and 70s. I mean, he wrote so much. Where do you even start with a man like that? But anyway, hope you enjoyed. Hope my sound is better, and I'll see you in the next one.